On the 15th of August, 1945, a Soviet pilot named Miroshnichenko caught a Japanese fighter off the coast of North Korea and shot it out of the sky. Nothing strange about that. The Red Army was tearing through Manchuria, and Japanese planes were falling everywhere. Except for one detail. The fighter Miroshnichenko was flying that day was built in Buffalo, New York. It was American to the bolts. And the United States had decided, years earlier, that this plane was not good enough to send into the war. So the Americans never flew it in combat. Not against Germany, not against Japan. They built more than 3,000 of them, and then they used them as flying targets back home, painting them bright orange and letting trainee gunners shoot at them with real bullets. But the Soviets took 2,400 of those rejected fighters. They flew them across Siberia, and in August of 1945, they pointed them at Japan's Kwantung army, the largest field army the Japanese Empire had left. 11 days later, that army was finished. This is the story of the Bell P-63 Kingcobra, the American fighter that America didn't want, the plane the Red Air Force turned into a tank killer over Manchuria, and one of the strangest Lend-Lease stories of the entire war. To understand why this fighter ended up in Soviet hands instead of American ones, you have to go back to its older brother, a plane called the P-39 Airacobra. The Airacobra was a genuinely weird machine. Most fighters of the era put the engine in the nose, right in front of the pilot. Bell aircraft did something different. They bolted the engine in the middle of the plane, behind the cockpit, and ran a long drive shaft forward under the pilot's seat to turn the propeller. Why? Because that freed up the nose, and into that empty nose, Bell stuffed a 37mm cannon, a gun that fired shells almost 1.5 inches across, straight through the spinning propeller hub. That cannon is the thing to remember. Hold on to it. On paper, the Airacobra looked deadly. In practice, the United States Army Air Forces grew to dislike it fast. The problem was altitude. The P-39 used an Allison engine with only a single-stage supercharger, which is the part that lets an engine keep breathing in the thin air up high. Above about 15,000 feet, the Airacobra ran out of breath. It got sluggish. And over Western Europe and the Pacific, where the air war was fought high, a fighter that died at altitude was close to useless. So American pilots passed on it. But here is where the story turns, because someone else looked at the exact same plane and saw something completely different. 1942. The Soviet Union was bleeding. The German invasion had swallowed enormous stretches of territory, and the air war on the Eastern Front was being fought low, down in the dirt, over tanks and trenches and infantry. Not high in the stratosphere, low. And down low, the Airacobra's weakness simply did not matter. What mattered was that 37mm cannon and a rugged airframe that could take a beating. The Soviets started receiving Airacobras through Lend-Lease, the American program that shipped war material to the Allies, and their pilots fell in love with the thing. The highest-scoring Allied ace outside the Soviet Air Force flew Airacobras. Inside the Soviet ranks, some of their best pilots racked up kill after kill in a fighter the Americans had basically thrown away. And the man whose name comes up again and again in that story is Alexander Pokryshkin. By the end of the war, he was one of the most decorated Soviet pilots alive, and he did much of his fighting in the very Airacobra the Americans didn't trust. His pilots trusted it completely. They learned its quirks, they learned to keep the fight low, and they turned a rejected American design into one of the deadliest tools on the Eastern Front. Remember that name too. Pokryshkin is going to matter later, in one of the most argued about corners of this whole story. The Russians had found a use for Bell's reject, and Bell, back in Buffalo, was already building its replacement. That replacement was the P-63 Kingcobra, and it first flew on the 7th of December 1942, 1 year to the day after Pearl Harbor. The Kingcobra was not just a bigger Airacobra. It was the plane the Airacobra should have been. Bell's engineers had listened to pilot complaints, and they fixed nearly all of them. The wing was completely redesigned, using a new shape called a laminar flow airfoil, the same cutting-edge idea going into the legendary P-51 Mustang. It cut drag and let the plane slip through the air cleaner. The wing was larger. The wingspan grew past 38 feet. The fuselage stretched longer, the tail was reshaped and rose higher. And the engine got a serious upgrade. The new Allison V1710 put out around 1,800 horsepower, a huge jump over the older model. More than that, Bell finally fixed the breathing problem. They added a second supercharger stage, the exact thing the Airacobra had been missing, so the engine could keep its power as the air got thin. The 3-blade propeller of the old plane gave way to a big 4-blade unit to bite into that extra power. The result was a fighter roughly 20% faster, a stronger climber, and far more comfortable at altitude than its predecessor had ever been. But the heart of the plane stayed exactly the same. That same mid-mounted engine, that same long drive shaft running under the pilot, and that same monstrous 37mm cannon, the M4, firing through the propeller hub. The Kingcobra kept the one thing that made the bloodline special and improved almost everything around it. So Bell had built a better fighter. Faster, tougher, harder hitting, and now it could actually breathe up high. You would think the United States Army Air Forces would have jumped at it. They didn't. And the reason they didn't is the strangest chapter in this whole story. By 1943 and 44, when the Kingcobra was ready, the American Air Forces already had the planes they wanted. The P-51 Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a flying tank that could absorb damage and dish it out. The Navy had its Hellcats and Corsairs carving up the Pacific. The Kingcobra was good, but it had arrived to a party where every chair was already taken. American factories were committed. American squadrons were trained on other types. There was simply no slot for one more medium-altitude fighter, no matter how solid it was. So, the United States made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable. They built thousands of these fighters and never sent a single one into American frontline combat. Not one confirmed combat sortie flown by an American pilot in an American Kingcobra against the enemy. The plane was, in the eyes of its own country, a reject before it ever fired a shot in anger. But the factories kept running, and if you build a fighter you refuse to send to war, you have to do something with it. What the Americans did with the Kingcobra is the part that nobody believes the first time they hear it. They turned it into a target. A flying, manned, deliberately shot-at target. Here was the problem the Americans were trying to solve. Bomber crews flying over Germany and Japan lived and died by their gunners, the men hunched behind machine guns trying to swat away enemy fighters. But training those gunners was nearly impossible. You can shoot at a toed sleeve or a cloth banner all day, but it teaches you almost nothing about hitting a real fighter that is twisting and diving and coming at you at hundreds of miles an hour, firing back, growing bigger in your sights by the second. The angles are different. The fear is different. And in a real bomber raid, a frightened teenager who has only ever shot at a calm cloth banner tends to miss. A United States officer named Major Cameron Fairchild had an idea that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who you ask. He had been chewing on the gunnery problem since 1942. What if gunners could shoot at an actual fighter plane, flown by an actual pilot, with actual live ammunition? You just needed a bullet that wouldn't kill the pilot. So Fairchild, working with researchers at Duke University, the University of Michigan, and the Bakelite Corporation, invented a frangible bullet. A round made of powdered lead held together with a brittle plastic-like binder, weighted to fly correctly, but designed to shatter into dust the instant it hit something solid. Fire it at an armored plane, and it splattered harmlessly instead of punching through. The military gave it a designation, the M22, and fed it into 30-caliber machine guns. On a cloth banner, the round did nothing useful. On a properly armored aircraft, it was survivable. And the plane they chose to armor up and shoot at was the rejected Kingcobra. They stripped out the guns. Then they bolted on more than a ton of armor plating, thick, bulletproof glass, and steel grills over every vital part, until the sleek fighter was wrapped in a shell of steel. They painted the planes in screaming bright orange so the gunners couldn't miss them. They rigged sensors all over the airframe to register hits. And then, mounted right in the center of the propeller hub, where that fearsome 37mm cannon used to sit, they put a big red light. Every time a gunner scored a hit, the nose of the plane lit up red, and a counter ticked over in the cockpit, totaling the strikes. The pilots called the planes pinballs, because that is exactly what it felt like. You flew straight at a formation of American bombers and let teenage gunners hose you down with live rounds, while your nose flashed like an arcade machine. It was as dangerous as it sounds. Read that again. American pilots were strapping into a fighter their own country had rejected and flying directly into streams of live machine gun fire, on purpose, several times a day. About 300 Kingcobras were converted into these manned targets. Over the life of the program, pinball pilots flew more than 11,000 of these missions, and student gunners fired something like 12 million rounds at them. The frangible bullets usually shattered the way they were supposed to. Usually. Not always. Now and then a round held together just enough, or a normal live round got loaded by mistake, and the glass cracked, or a pilot got hurt. It was, by any honest measure, one of the wildest training programs of the entire war. So that was the American Kingcobra, a reject turned into a flying arcade target, lighting up red over the airfields of the United States, while the real war raged on the other side of two oceans. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the same aircraft was about to do something the Americans never let it do: fight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of the war's strangest aircraft, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the weapons and the stories the standard documentaries skip right past, and there is a lot more coming. So here is where things get interesting. While the Americans were using Kingcobras for target practice, the Soviet Union was quietly becoming the plane's real owner. The numbers tell the whole story. Bell built 3,303 Kingcobras in total. Of those, 2,421 went to the Soviet Union. That is more than 70% of every Kingcobra ever made, handed straight to the Red Air Force. The Soviets ordered roughly 2,450 and received nearly all of them. By any definition, the USSR was not just a customer for this fighter. The USSR was the operator. The Kingcobra was, in practice, a Soviet combat aircraft that happened to be built in New York. Getting them there was its own epic, and it had a name: the AlSib route, short for Alaska-Siberia. It started at Great Falls, Montana, where American ferry pilots picked up brand new aircraft straight from the factories. From there, the planes flew north through western Canada, along a chain of rough airfields, into the Alaskan interior, and landed at Ladd Field near Fairbanks. At Fairbanks, the handoff happened. Soviet pilots took the controls, signed for the aircraft, and flew them onward across the Bering Sea and into the frozen vastness of Siberia, all the way to Krasnoyarsk, thousands of miles deeper inside the Soviet Union. It was a brutal piece of flying. The cold could freeze instruments and crack metal. The weather closed in without warning. Planes and pilots were lost along the route, not to enemy fire, but to ice, fog, and mountains. And yet the line held. Across the whole war, something like 8,000 American aircraft of all types crossed into Soviet hands this way, eventually making up close to a fifth of the entire Soviet Air Force. The Kingcobras flew that same gauntlet. The very last one was delivered all the way out at the Kamchatka Peninsula on the 29th of September, 1945. And this is where we hit the part of the story that honest historians argue about. So I am going to give it to you straight, instead of pretending it is settled. The question is simple. Did Soviet Kingcobras fight the Germans? Here is what we know for certain. Back in 1943, the United States and the Soviet Union reached an agreement. The Americans asked the Soviets not to use the P-63 against Germany, and to concentrate the fighter in the Far East instead, holding it in reserve for an eventual war with Japan. On paper, the Kingcobra was supposed to sit out the European fighting entirely, but paper and reality do not always match, and there are accounts from both sides that suggest some Kingcobras did slip into the fight against the Luftwaffe. Remember Pukrishkin, the great Soviet ace? One pilot who served under him claimed that an entire Guards fighter regiment, the 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, secretly converted to the P-63 in 1944 and took it into combat. And on the German side, the famous Stuka pilot Hans Rudel wrote in his memoirs that over the Courland Pocket in early 1945, he and other German pilots kept running into American types, and he specifically named Kingcobras among them. There are even scattered claims of P-63s fighting near Königsberg and on the final drive toward Berlin. So, which is it? Here is the honest answer. The official Soviet records do not confirm any P-63 combat against Germany. The stories exist, they come from real people, and many historians find them believable, but they remain anecdotes, not documented fact. If anyone tells you with total certainty that the Kingcobra dueled the Luftwaffe over Berlin, they are going further than the evidence allows. The most you can say is, maybe, possibly. In small numbers, unofficially, by pilots who liked the plane and used it whether or not the paperwork said they could. What is not in doubt, what is solid and documented and certain, is what the Kingcobra did next. Because in the summer of 1945, the Soviet Union finally turned east, and the Kingcobra finally went to war for real. To understand what these fighters were flying into, you have to understand the target: Japan's Kwantung Army. For years, the Kwantung Army had been the pride of the Japanese Empire. It garrisoned Manchuria, the puppet state Japan had carved out of northeastern China, and at its peak it was an elite force, the army that had launched Japan's conquest of the mainland. On paper, in August of 1945, it still looked enormous. Around 780,000 men, 24 infantry divisions, tank divisions, hundreds of armoured vehicles, roughly 2,000 aircraft. But those numbers were a ghost. Over the previous 3 years, Japan had been losing the Pacific War, island by island, and to feed that meat grinder, it had stripped the Kwantung Army bare. The best divisions, the veteran troops, the modern equipment, the experienced pilots, all of it had been pulled south to fight the Americans. What was left in Manchuria by 1945 was a hollow shell. And it was not just thin, it was obsolete. The tanks were mostly early 1930s models, the little Type 95 Ha-Go and the Type 89 I-Go, machines that Soviet armour would punch through without slowing down. The anti-tank guns were light 37mm pieces that simply bounced off the thick frontal armour of a Soviet tank. The infantry was packed with raw conscripts, short on machine guns, with almost no submachine guns at all. Historians who study the campaign describe what was left as something closer to a light infantry police force than a real field army. It could chase bandits. It could not stop a modern armoured offensive. That brings us to the air, and here the rot was worst of all. The Japanese air units in Manchuria were starved of fuel. Most of their planes could barely get off the ground, let alone mount a real defence. The 2,000 aircraft on paper were, in reality, a force that mostly sat grounded while the world ended around it. A fleet of obsolescent machines with empty tanks and inexperienced crews. Into this hollow giant, on the 9th of August 1945, the Soviet Union slammed one of the most overwhelming offensives in military history. The codename history remembers is August Storm. More than 1.5 million Soviet troops, hardened by 4 years of crushing the German army, poured across the borders of Manchuria from 3 directions at once, with thousands of tanks and aircraft behind them. And flying cover over the western pincer were the Kingcobras. The 2 key units were the 190th and the 245th Fighter Aviation Divisions, both attached to the Trans-Baikal Front, the force punching in from Mongolia. The 190th Division, commanded by Major General Fokin, had been the first to convert to the new American fighter. It moved to the Trans-Baikal region in June, and by the 2nd of August, its pilots had finished retraining on the P-63. Days later, they were at war. The 245th Division flew the Kingcobra II, with regiments like the 940th and the 781st, all of them riding that improved Allison engine over the Manchurian plains. The Kingcobras flew the missions the Red Air Force had perfected against Germany, escorting bombers, hammering ground targets, strafing columns of retreating Japanese troops, and here, finally, every quality that had made the Americans reject this fighter became irrelevant. The fighting was low, the enemy was disorganized and largely grounded, and that big 37mm cannon, the gun that had ridden in the nose of this bloodline since the very beginning, was perfect for tearing into trucks, rail cars, and the thin-skinned light armor of those obsolete Japanese tanks. The reject from Buffalo had finally found a war that fit it like a glove. The first confirmed Kingcobra air victory came on the 15th of August, 1945. A Soviet pilot, Lieutenant Miroshnichenko of the 17th Fighter Regiment, part of that same 190th Division, caught a Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 fighter off the coast of North Korea and shot it down. An American-built fighter, flown by a Soviet pilot, scoring its first kill against Japan, in a plane the United States had refused to send to any front at all. The very engagement the plane had been held in reserve for since 1943 had finally arrived, and the Kingcobra had drawn first blood. And the Japanese could barely fight back. With their aircraft grounded by fuel shortages and their best units long gone to the Pacific, the once proud Kwantung army crumbled at a speed that stunned even the Soviets. The offensive opened on the 9th. By the 16th, major Japanese defenses across eastern Manchuria had collapsed. Within roughly 11 days of hard fighting, the largest field army Japan had left was broken, surrendering in droves, its remnants scattering across the Manchurian plains, while Soviet tanks rolled hundreds of miles deep. The defeat was so total, so fast, that many historians now argue it was just as important as the atomic bombs in pushing Japan to surrender. The Kwantung Army had been one of Tokyo's last cards. Japanese leaders had told themselves they could hold out on the Asian mainland, drag the war on, and bargain for better terms. When that army fell apart in under 2 weeks, that whole fantasy died with it. There was nothing left to hold out with. And the Kingcobra was there for all of it. Not as a footnote, as frontline air cover for one of the most decisive blitzes of the entire war. Think about the full arc of that for a second. This was a fighter so unwanted by its own country that they wrapped it in a ton of armor, painted it orange, and shot at it for sport. And in the hands of Soviet pilots, that same airframe helped shatter a 1,000,000-man army in 11 days. So why does almost nobody know the Kingcobra's name? Part of it is timing. The plane reached the front right at the very end, in the final weeks of a war that everyone already knew was ending. There was no long, glorious combat record to build a legend around, no years of dogfights, just one short, violent campaign in the far corner of Asia, and then the guns went quiet. Part of it is the politics that came after. Within a couple of years, the wartime friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union had curdled into the Cold War. A story about America handing the Soviets 2,400 fighters that helped the Red Army win a stunning victory, was not exactly the kind of tale either side wanted to tell. The Americans did not want to celebrate arming the enemy they now feared. The Soviets did not want to admit how much of their air force had come stamped "Made in USA." So it got quietly buried under decades of mutual suspicion. And part of it is the simplest reason of all. The Kingcobra never fought for the country that built it. American histories had no American combat record to write about, so the plane slipped through the cracks of memory. Soviet histories tended to fold it in with the more famous Airacobra, treating the King as just a footnote to its older brother. And so, this fighter, more than 3,000 built,
2,400 sent to war, ended up as one of the most produced combat aircraft almost no one remembers. But the record is the record. The Bell P-63 Kingcobra was an American fighter that America used as a flying target, while the Soviet Union flew it into one of the most lopsided victories of the Second World War. The plane nobody wanted helped finish off an empire. The next time you hear someone list the great fighters of the war, the Mustangs and the Spitfires and the Zeros, remember the orange-painted reject from Buffalo with the red light in its nose. Remember that somewhere off the coast of Korea, in the last days of the war, one of those rejects rolled in behind a Japanese fighter and lit it up for real. Not with a flashing bulb this time. With that big 37mm gun it had carried, unused by its own country, all the way from a New York factory to the other side of the world. If you want more stories like this, the weapons history left in the margins, subscribe and stick around. There are a lot more rejects, surprises, and forgotten machines where this one came from.